what I propose to do is briefly review the basics of what I have to say, which I said at some length yesterday. My basic inspiration, earliest inspiration, was Ramana Maharshi. From the age of 12, for me he is the epitome of anything other than me. And he has said several times, self-realization is the easiest thing. And Ramana Maharshi was not a talkative man. Therefore, whatever he said had great weight and importance. So he said, self-realization is the easiest thing. When I read that, I remember some time ago, I said, what could that mean? The simplest thing, my interpretation of it was to accept what is. And not to want anything different from what is. To me, those words meant just that. And what is the impersonal awareness of existence. I am. That is what is. And in that impersonal awareness of I am, there is the manifestation, which is witnessed by that I am. What is the manifestation. And what is the manifestation? In the words of Lord Buddha, events happen, deeds are done, there is no individual doer thereof. Therefore, witnessing what happens, more or less as you witness a movie, without wanting it to be any different, is my interpretation of Ramana Maharshi's words. Self-realization is the simplest thing. It does not become the simplest thing because someone, the ego, wants something, even if that wanting be self-realization. Even if the wanting is self-realization, it is still wanting. And that is the obstruction to the realization of the self. Based on this, what is the first basic I have? The first basic I have is very simple. All there is the source. What you call it is really immaterial, so long as there is always the remembrance in the heart of what the word stands for. Therefore, you can call it consciousness, as the Upanishads call it. You can call it consciousness, you can call it the absolute, you can call it unmanifest, you can call it potential energy, or you can call it God, which I do. So when I use the word God, I repeatedly tell you that by God I do not mean any entity, however powerful, however all-knowing, however merciful, connected with the manifestation. That is not the God I am talking about. It is this God which the atheist says does not exist. It is this God connected with manifestation which I believe the atheist says does not exist. So the atheist came to me and said that he has made a deep study of the subject. He has got a doctorate in comparative religions, and after 20 years of deep study, he has come to the firm conclusion that God does not exist. The God that he says does not exist is this entity connected with the manifestation. But God as the source, the one from which everything else has come, is a different matter altogether. Therefore, to the atheist I would ask, God may or may not exist. But do you doubt that you exist? No one can deny that he exists. And that is the only truth in phenomenality. I am. Anything away from it becomes a concept, which some people may accept, some people may not. And the concept is something which can be interpreted, as I told you yesterday. So the basic is, all there is the source, consciousness. And it is from the source that the manifestation emerges. So the unmanifest and the manifest, Buddha's nirvana and samsara, which repeatedly the Buddha said, are not two. He said nirvana is samsara and samsara is nirvana. Meaning both are aspects of the source. So there is the source from which has come about the manifestation. A remarkably appropriate metaphor given in the Hindu scriptures is that of the spider producing the web. The spider does not use any material outside of himself in producing the web. So, if consciousness is all there is, then obviously consciousness does not use any material outside of itself to produce the manifestation. Therefore, the consciousness which produces the manifest, or from which the manifestation comes, is consciousness at rest, which becomes consciousness in movement when there is manifestation. So first basic is only one, that it is the unmanifest which becomes the manifest. They are not two. All there is consciousness. That is the first basic. From this basic, what emerges is that the human being is part of the manifest. But the unmanifest and the manifest are not two. Therefore, the basic misconception of spiritual seeking is that what the human being seeks, what the seeker seeks, is something apart from life, which is the basic misconception. It cannot be apart from life. It cannot be apart from manifestation, because manifestation is not different from the unmanifest, the source. And obviously what the seeker seeks cannot be outside the source. So basically, whatever the spiritual seeker seeks has to do with the manifestation and its function. Now, the acceptance of the unmanifest producing the manifest, the scientist has had some difficulty with it. According to the scientist, only that which his senses can perceive and observe is, according to the traditional scientist, is real. Everything else is just a concept. So, there is the story of the millionaire and his friend, the scientist. The millionaire was a spiritual seeker. So he believed in the seeker from which the manifestation has come. The scientist would not. And whenever they met, again and again they would come to the same subject. And the millionaire seeker could not convince the scientist. So what he did was to produce, at great expense, an actual model of the solar system on a fairly large scale. The system, as soon as it was turned on, would go about exactly like the solar system, of which the earth was a small bit. And when it was functioning, the millionaire asked his friend to come and visit him. The scientist came, and the millionaire took him to the studio where this system, model system, was functioning. The scientist was absolutely aghast. He had never anticipated anything like this. He had never seen anything like it. So the first question that he asks is, who made this? And the millionaire replied, oh, it just came by itself. It just happened by itself. So the first thing is the unmanifest and the manifest, consciousness at rest and consciousness in movement, potential energy and activized energy are not two. The usual explanation given is, why did the unmanifest create the manifest? Because it was natural. And the word natural is explained more easily by the concept of potential energy producing the activized. So the manifestation is potential energy or the activization of the potential energy. Why did the potential have to activize itself? Because it is the nature of the potential to activize. Otherwise, it wouldn't be potential. It would be dead matter. That is the natural explanation of the word natural. So the first basic is that the unmanifest and the manifest are not two. Now, the second basic I have is that the human being is an object. One species of object, which together with thousands of other species of objects constitutes the totality of objects in manifestation. But it is a special kind of object. The human being, again according to my concept, is a uniquely programmed object, a uniquely programmed mechanism through which the source functions and brings about actions strictly according to the way they are supposed to be according to the source. That is the second basic. In other words, the human being does not create his actions, but actions are created by the source or God through the mechanism of the human being. And for that reason, each human being is uniquely programmed. The unique programming is this. No human being has had a choice of parents. Therefore, the unique DNA in every human object is not in his control. For the same reason, the human being has not been able to choose his environment in which that object was born and been conditioned in that environment. So this unique DNA plus the environmental conditioning together is what I call the programming in a human object. But as one Pulitzer-winning journalist has said, in that human mechanism, there is a mechanism which prevents the human mechanism from seeing its mechanistic nature. And that mechanism is what is generally known as the ego. The ego is the sense of personal doership. The other day, I saw a a cartoon with two puppets discussing whether there is truly a hand up there manipulating them. That is what the ego has always been saying. And that is the spiritual search. Is there a hand manipulating us? So the second basic is, it is God functioning, God meaning the source, which is functioning through every human being and bringing about actions, not according to the will of the individual, but according to the will of God, according to His own law, according to His own basics, according to the will of God. You may call it divine law or universal law, or just accept that nothing happens unless it is the will of God, which is my next basic. The basic being, I repeat, the human being is concerned only with the manifestation and its functioning, with the deepest understanding that that itself has come from the source, and the two are not different. That is the first basic. The second basic is that the human being is an instrument, a uniquely programmed instrument through which God brings about such actions as are intended to be produced. These are the two main basics. And if any question arises concerning life, I always say, go back to the basics, and almost certainly the question will dissolve itself. Go back to the basics if any question arises. And I'm almost certain that almost every question will dissolve in the basics. So, this ego, the ego has had to be created, as I said yesterday, because it is the ego in billions of human organisms which separates itself from the others, and the interhuman relationships are caused, without which life as we know it cannot happen. So for life as we know it to happen, God has to create the ego, and as I said, the moment God has created the ego, according to my concept, God also started the process of demolishing the ego so that the two basics could be seen. That's all it is. So the destruction of the ego means the clear realization all the time of the two basics. If we see it this way, isn't self-realization the simplest thing? In the words of Ramana Maharshi, it is the simplest thing. But why is it not seen by everybody? Because it is not God's will. God's will is that at any time, only a few egos should be able to see it. So what Ramana Maharshi says is, it is for those few egos that the self-realization is the simplest thing. So, if it is God's will that the self-realization should happen, it will happen. If it is not God's will for self-realization to happen in a particular body-mind organism, nothing that the ego can do will produce it. If that is acceptable, then that is self-realization, which again is the simplest thing. So how does God bring about an action? Through the computerized human being. Again, as I said, exactly as you use your computer. So what happens? God puts in an input. What is the input? A thought comes over which you have no control, or something is seen or heard. That is the input. The brain reacts to it, and produces an output which the ego says is my action. In other words, something is seen. The brain reacts to what is seen. Anger arises. So the anger is the output brought about by the input of what is seen. Now, yesterday the question was, does the output, which is a feeling, produce any action? Was that the question? Anyway, that I assume is. So what happens is, the output and its action is just one thing. Let me give you an example. Suppose a person is walking along the road. He sees a woman being molested. So the scene, the woman being molested, is the input. The brain reacts to it and produces anger, and the consequent action resulting from that anger. All of it is the output. So the man who sees this gets angry. He thinks he gets angry. But anger arises, and the anger produces an action strictly according to the programming in the body-mind organism. And if the body-mind organism is programmed to be in such a position to go and help, and is brave enough to tackle the person, that is what will happen. So the output will be an anger resulting in this body-mind organism going to help the woman, and in trying to help the woman, the man who was molesting gets hurt. So because of the fracas, the policemen come, arrest both people, take them to the jail. So far, the ego has not come in question. The ego has not come in action. Anger happens, the anger causes the fight, and because of the fight, both people are taken to the police station. Now the ego comes in, and the ego says, I was angry, and it was stupid of me to go and help the woman. That was not my job. Why did I go and try to help the woman? And now I find myself in the police custody, in jail. Whereas I had an important appointment, business appointment, which could have got me 1,000,000 marks. How stupid. That is the ego. The happening of the action was not the ego's action. You see? Now, if this body-mind organism, which went and saved the woman, happened to be that of the sage, then the difference is this. There is no ego there, no sense of doership. Therefore, there is no ego, he says. I had no business to interfere with something happening on the road. That reaction of the ego is absent. So it is accepted that the reaction arose, and the reaction took the shape of ultimately ending in his being in police custody. So the sage accepts being in police custody as something that was exactly destined to happen to that body-mind organism at that moment. That is the difference. The ego says, I had no business to do that, and therefore I am in this strange situation where I missed my appointment and possibly 1,000,000 marks. The sage accepts it, and he sits there until he is let out. There is a story about this. A rabbi used to go every morning, meet a number of people, deal with their needs, and come back. Nearby was a police station. a policeman used to see this rabbi going out every morning and sometimes coming with his satchel full of things which his people had given him, gifts on his way. So he says, every day he goes and comes back. I wonder where he goes. So the policeman asked the rabbi one morning, Rabbi, where do you go out in the morning? What do you do? And the rabbi says, I don't know. The policeman gets angry, takes him to the police station, locks him up for a couple of hours, and then lets him go. So while going, the rabbi says, you see, I didn't know. I didn't know that you were going to arrest me and put me. So that is the difference. Now there's one more thing. Supposing instead of one sage going along the road, there were two sages. Both see the same thing. One body-mind organism goes and helps. The other one hesitates. Why? Because that body-mind organism, timidity is one of the part of the programming of that other sage. So he doesn't go. And he goes about his business, whatever he was supposed to do. The ordinary man who did not go would have said, my friend went and helped. I wish I had done that too. I am a timid man. I wish I were not timid. I wish I were brave. I wonder if there is some therapy which will make me a brave man. That is the ego, which is not there in the case of a sage. So the sage, one sage accepts what has happened and is quite calm being in the jail, in the police custody. The other knows that his body-mind organism is timid and therefore he did not go and help, so he goes about his business. That is how God functions through a body-mind organism. The arising of the anger, or it could be anything, it could be compassion. Arising of the anger or compassion or fear or whatever takes its own course of action, may or may not take some course of action. So the arising of the feeling or emotion and the attendant action is one piece, is one output. The ego comes later. If the ego reacts to that output, then there is the ego. That is the only difference between the body-mind organism of an ordinary person and the body-mind organism of a sage. The programming may be very, very similar. So the output will be exactly the same. So whether it is the ordinary person or a sage, going to help the woman may happen. But the ego comes in later. In the case of the ordinary man, the ego is frustrated. So the output includes not only the arising of the emotion, but also the attendant action. That is how God functions through every human being. And if this is seen very clearly, that there is no sense of personal doership, but that it is a fiction. It is a fiction created by divine hypnosis. And it is only divine hypnosis created by God. It is only God who can remove the hypnosis. The hypnotized ego cannot remove the hypnosis. It's as simple as that. That is what Ramana Maharshi said when he said self-realization is the simplest thing. To realize that the ego is a divine hypnosis, and only God can remove that hypnosis. And that is what he is actually doing by making certain people spiritual seekers, or at least making them think they are spiritual seekers. What God has done is, again to use Ramana Maharshi's words, he has put those heads in the tiger's mouth. And how long it will take, whether it will happen at all, and how much misery the process will take, will depend on God's will and the destiny of each seeker. Ramana Maharshi used the simile of three kinds of will. He said, if the wood is dry, then just a spark will make it glow into a fire. If the wood is not so dry, it may take some time. And if the wood is wet wood, it will take still longer time. But if the wet wood can do nothing about it. Therefore, I said yesterday, the unique thing about the spiritual seeking is this. In a normal seeking, the seeker stops the seeking only when he gets what he wanted. In the spiritual seeking, the seeker stops seeking when he realizes that he didn't start the seeking. And therefore, he really is not the seeker. At that moment, the seeking stops. Not when the seeker finds what he has got. In fact, that means the seeker realizes that what he wanted could not be had. Because the seeker is what he is seeking. That is the unique part of the spiritual teaching. The seeker stops seeking when he realizes that he has never been the seeker. Seeker means the doer. Therefore, my basic inphenomenality is very simple. Nothing happens unless it is the will of God. And the will of God in respect of every human being is what I call the destiny of that human object, not the ego. The ego has no destiny. It is the object which has the destiny. So God's will in respect of every object that He has produced is the destiny of that object. As I said yesterday, I repeat, on what basis does God go about His business? This question is asked by the intellect, human intellect, a created object. And a created object can never know the will of the Creator's subjectivity. Therefore, I repeat again, Meister Eckhart's quotation, all that the human being can do is to wonder and marvel at the magnificence of God's creation. He cannot try to solve the mystery, accept it as a mystery. And the whole misery of seeking is that the seeker does not accept it. So the misery of the seeking, how long it will last, will depend again, as I said, on the will of God and the destiny of the body-mind organism. So how quickly it will be accepted, if it is accepted at all, will depend on the receptivity in that programmed body-mind organism of the seeker. So if any question arises, the basic you have got to go back to is, this is what is supposed to be at this moment according to God's will and the destiny of the body-mind organism concerned. How can the question proceed further? The question has to collapse. But to be able to go back to the basic is itself not in anyone's control. I'll say go back to the basics. So you are entitled to ask me, how do I go back to the basics? Not in your control. But at least you will know when you have not gone back to the basics, with the misery, if the misery continues, then you will realize, I have not gone back to the basics. So the involvement and the understanding go very closely together. You have no control over the arising of the involvement. You have no control over cutting off the involvement. But God, who started the seeking, has sent you here. And you have heard that nothing happens unless it is the will of God. So even that intellectual understanding that nothing is in my control, nothing can happen unless it is the will of God, and that even the seeking that I am doing could not have happened unless it was God's will. That is the basic understanding. While we have no control over being able to cut off the involvement, what happens is, as I said, you are here, you have listened to this basic concept. Nothing can happen unless it is the will of God. So the involvement is not in your control. Then how does it get cut off? It gets cut off because the understanding, even at the intellectual level, arises as part of God's will and cuts off the involvement. So the ego gets involved, but the ego has no control over cutting off the involvement. The cutting off of the involvement is done by the understanding in action. The understanding may be even at the intellectual level. So, in a conceptual scale of 0 to 10, what happens? The ego gets, there is an input which results in an output, and the ego gets involved in that output. Involvement is started. The involvement may go from 0 to 10. If there is a basic understanding, even intellectual understanding, I keep repeating even intellectual understanding, because the intellectual understanding is grossly devalued. They say, oh, it's only intellectual understanding. People come to me and say, I have the understanding, I've read your books, it's only intellectual understanding. I want that understanding to go deeper. You see, I have read your books, I have got the understanding, but it is only intellectual. So I tell them, don't devalue, don't discount the intellectual understanding. In most cases, that is where the process begins. Intellectual understanding. So, the intellectual understanding is what cuts off the involvement. Maybe at 9. Then gradually, as the understanding goes deeper, the involvement gets cut off at 9, 8, 7, 6, until when the understanding is really deep, the happening of the involvement and getting cut off can be almost simultaneous. Therefore, there is no damage to be done by the involvement. Now, next point is, all this is conceptual, make no mistake. It is not the truth. So conceptually, how does the understanding, intellectual understanding, go deeper? What is the intellectual understanding? Let me get back again to the basic. The intellectual understanding is, nothing happens unless it is the will of God. Therefore, I am not the doer. That is the basic, even intellectual. I am not the thinker, thinking happens. I am not the doer, doing happens. I am not the experiencer, experiencing happens. That is the basic understanding, even intellectual. So this understanding that there is truly no individual doer, how does it get deeper? That gets deeper by Ramana Maharshi's self-inquiry. Who am I? Now, who am I is not an idle inquiry. Ramana Maharshi stresses it repeatedly. By the grace of Ramana, I am trying to make it more practical. So, what I say is, Ramana Maharshi's inquiry, who am I, can be made deeper from investigation of one's actions, day after day, analyzing one's actions from personal experience. So the concept that I am not the doer is a concept in the beginning. But when the individual body-mind organism through which acts happen, the ego, sees from personal experience, day after day, after investigation. Who does the investigation? Of course the ego. Someone else doing the investigation, the ego will not accept. So the ego has to do the investigation himself from his personal experience, come to the conclusion at the end of the day, no action today has been my action. And this action, which is not my action, and every action that is the conclusion, then the frustrated ego asks the question, if no action is my action, who is this me? Who am I, Ramana Maharshi? My question is, the ego asks himself, who is this me? Is there a me at all? Is there a me at all? And that question can be sheer, unadulterated misery. Because that question, the very existence of the me, every moment harasses him until the answer comes. And the seeker, often treated as a lunatic, is because this question bothers him so much. There have been seekers actually put into a lunatic asylum. My earliest guru's guru was put in an asylum. And the curious part of it is, a lot of people used to go and see him in the lunatic asylum. So this question, is there a me, becomes so pathetically deep that the question then is not asked by the ego is almost dying. And yet the question remains, is there a me? Who is this me? So when the ego is almost dying and the question remains, then the question is asked really by the source. Is there a me at all who suffers so much? And again, if it is the will of God and the destiny of that body-mind organism of the seeker, the answer comes from the source. My dear child, there never was a me to suffer. There never was a me. The sense of personal doership. And that is the end of the seeking. The true end of the seeking. That is, the concept that I am not the doer is accepted intellectually. That is the end of the seeking. But the concept becomes the truth only when from personal experience the ego comes to the conclusion, no act has been my act, from personal experience, from investigation into personal experience. Then for that individual seeker, the concept becomes the truth, that he is not the doer. And because he thinks he is the doer, he thinks something that he has done has caused suffering. And he suffers. Yesterday there was a question of suffering also. The point about suffering. There is suffering and there is satisfaction. A sage, a hungry sage is fed. Is there no satisfaction? In the East, it is easily expressed by an enormous burp. So the satisfaction is expressed. It is not hidden. So, on the other hand, if it happens that there is suffering, there is suffering. But the point about the suffering is that with the understanding, the body-mind organism of a sage can suffer. It can suffer physically or it can suffer a grief, psychologically. But the difference in the suffering of the ordinary man and the sage is this. The sage sees the suffering. The sage witnesses the suffering. The sage witnesses the suffering happening in some other body-mind organism or in this. That makes no difference. The difference is only this. This body-mind organism will cry in agony if the physical suffering is bad enough, just as some other body-mind organism may scream. So to the sage it makes no difference which body-mind organism screams, because it is a body-mind organism screaming because of the suffering. So about suffering, my concept is this. There is suffering, but truly no individual sufferer. Unless the ego identifies itself with the suffering and says, I am suffering. Just as anger arises and the ego says, I am angry, I shouldn't be angry. I am timid, I shouldn't be timid. I am suffering, I don't want to suffer. So there is suffering, but truly no individual sufferer. About physical suffering, I had an occasion to experiment myself. In 1988, I had to have an appendix operation. So the operation was done by a friend of mine, a surgeon, at 7 or 8 in the morning. And I could feel the cut. First the surgeon made a small cut. And then he went on lengthening the cut until I thought it was across the whole of the stomach. Later he explained to me that the appendix was not a clean appendix. It was sticking to the walls of the abdomen. Therefore he had to scrape it off. And for that reason he had to make the cut longer and longer. Anyway, he said, you are not suffering now because you are under an anesthetic. But the pain will start. soon enough. And the nurse has instructions to do the needful. It so happened that I'm talking 1988. No, wait a minute, not 1988, 1948. 50 years ago. When the stay in the hospital, the usual stay was 10 days. Not 2 days or 3 days as it is now. I think it's only 2 or 3 days. It was 10 days then. And it so happened that I had not taken any leave for a long time. So to me, it seemed like a vacation. Pain or no pain. So the thought came to me, let me watch this pain. Let me see what happens. I don't have to go to office tomorrow. I have this luxury of watching the pain and seeing what it happens. So after a while, the pain started. The nurse came and said, shall I give you an injection? So I told the nurse, no, it's quite bearable. And it went on, and I could watch the pain rising up, and then at a certain point, it leveled off and didn't keep on climbing. So when it leveled off, another thought came to me. If I had been born with that level of pain in my stomach, I would have accepted it as part of the body. So I continued with that pain at that level. The nurse came several times. So I said, no, it's all right. Then later in the evening, the nurse said, I will give you the injection now because you can have your food and go to sleep. You can have a better sleep. So my experiment was over. So my point is that witnessing the pain means keeping away from the identification with the pain. And what would have been seen as unbearable became bearable. If you ask me, how long would I have waited for the pain to climb up? I don't know. That would depend on the programming in the body-mind organism of the ability to bear pain. In fact, the next day, the nurse went to the surgeon and must have told him he never had an injection. So the surgeon, when he saw me next, he said, Ramesh, I wouldn't have believed that you have this capacity to bear pain. And I said, I would agree with you. How can a Brahmin body-mind organism have unusual power to bear pain? So I said, I honestly don't think there is particularly strong ability to bear pain. Then I told him, this is how the experiment began. So my point is, witnessing the pain can reduce the pain to a large extent. Heiner Siegelman had a peculiar experience. Now there, the German body-mind organism was probably programmed with a lot of ability to bear pain. Anyway, his experience was that there was no pain at all. He said there was no pain at all. Because he did the same thing. There was witnessing of the pain. And there was, in his case, no pain at all. And in this case of a Brahmin body-mind organism, it was bearable. So even the suffering, physical suffering, what about the mental suffering? Bereavement, death of someone close. Ramana Maharshi once received information by letter that an attendant of his, a close attendant of his, over many years, had died somewhere. And there were tears in Ramana Maharshi's eyes. So what had happened? The news was an input. The brain reacted to that input. Tears arose. So you could either say tears arose as a natural reaction of the brain, or you could say Ramana Maharshi was weeping. And some people must have thought, how can he be a jnani? He is weeping at the loss of a friend. So the grief arises just as satisfaction arises after a meal when it was needed. Grief may arise, but with the understanding, what happens? With the understanding, what happens is that the grief arises and dies at that moment. It doesn't horizontally turn into mourning. A friend of mine, his wife died after 55 years of marriage. So I went to see him after about 8 or 10 days. That is again part of the programming of this body-mind organism. It does not like to go and see a friend in the hospital when he is sick. I prefer to see him when he is better. So I didn't go to see this bereaved friend immediately. But when I went and saw him almost 8 or 10 days after the event, when I went to him, he suddenly started weeping uncontrollably. And then he said, you see, Ramesh, this is what happens. Now it's 8 or 10 days. I still weep uncontrollably as if it had just happened. And the problem was, he had one of the biggest collections of spiritual books. And he thought he was a jnani. So I think his real pain was not the loss of his wife, but the loss of his jnaniship. He told me, he said, look, I thought I understood things, and yet here I am, weeping and mourning. You see? So when I came back home, something compulsively drove me to my desk, and I wrote him a brief letter. As I said, it was a compulsive thing. The moment I had it posted, there was a thought, perhaps I shouldn't have done it. Anyway, it's been done. So in that letter, I told him, whatever happens is according to the programming in that body-mind organism. Supposing, I said, you did not love your wife and she had died, you would not have mourned. And then you would have considered yourself a jnani. You see? On the other hand, what happened was, when my wife and I were in Seattle, my older son, who had suddenly become very ill, died. So when we had news that he was very seriously ill, my wife left Seattle on her way back to Bombay. So when she was in New Jersey, waiting for her plane back to Bombay, I had news that he had already died. So she called me and said she has got this medicine, that medicine, which she's going to try. I didn't tell her. So what I did was, I continued the talk. That was the very first talk in the series of seminars was the next day. So when the news came, there was grief, tremendous grief. The grief arose and it died. I'm not saying that it did not come again. It did come again, but each time it came, each time it collapsed. What I'm saying is, because of the understanding, the grief of the moment was not horizontally involved into mourning. So, psychological pain, grief, or physical pain, when it is possible to disidentify yourself from that pain, when I said it is possible, if it is possible, and whether it is possible or not, will depend on God's will and the destiny of the body, mind, organism. So suffering, basically what I would say is, there is suffering, but not necessarily a sufferer. In most cases, a sufferer, yes, but not in every case, not necessarily a sufferer. Suffering, yes, because suffering and happiness, the two extremes, are very basis of life as we know it. How can there be no suffering? But it is possible not to be a sufferer. That was one of the points that came up yesterday evening. Now the third point that came up yesterday was karma. Heiner Siegelman wanted to interview Dalai Lama once when he was in India, in Bombay. So he told me, and he rang me and he said, I'm not coming to Bombay, because he had called Dalai Lama's office. He spoke to his secretary, and the secretary asked him what was the interview. He wanted to interview Dalai Lama. So the secretary asked him what it is about. And he said it's about the spiritual part of it. So the secretary told Heiner that Dalai Lama now speaks mostly on Tibet and China. But if you want to interview him, you are welcome to come. But he is not in the mood to speak on such matters. But in any case, he gave him an advice. He said, if you do come and interview Dalai Lama, please don't ask him if he believes in rebirth. It would be like asking Pope if he is a Roman Catholic. So rebirth, karma, all that is based, the very basic, intrinsically basic concept about rebirth and karma is the individual does an action. And what I'm saying is, no individual is capable of doing any action. No action is an individual's action. No action happens unless it is the will of God. And that, curiously, is also supposed to be Buddha's saying. Events happen, deeds are done, there is no individual doer thereof. If there is no individual doer, who is a sinner? How can there ever be any sinner? Who commits the sin? The individual doesn't do anything. Therefore, if you accept, if you are able to accept the concept that no individual is a doer, then the question of rebirth is useless. But it's so persistent, particularly in the East. My point is this, that is what the people who come to me, particularly Indians, I appreciate that this is very logical, but I can't get rid of this conditioning over generations about rebirth. Then I asked him, Suppose your name is Gopal. So Gopal is told that Gopal suffers in this life because Gopal did something very wrong in a previous birth. And Gopal is also told, you must do good deeds in this life so that Gopal in the next life will not suffer. And my point is, was there a Gopal in the previous birth? Will there be a Gopal in the next birth? To feel that he, Gopal, is enjoying the fruits of his actions in the previous birth. There was no Gopal in the previous birth. There will be no Gopal in the next birth. Some body-mind organism with a different ego did something, and Gopal is supposed to suffer for those actions. I can quite understand that actions cannot go anywhere. Actions, emotions which happen in this body-mind organ will all go into the pool of consciousness, from which some will be infused into another birth. So even there, my concept is no emotions, ambitions left unfulfilled, or pride or whatever accumulated in this birth in a particular body-mind organism can be logically transferred to another. They all go into the pool of consciousness, from which, when a new conception takes place, God or the source infuses a certain part of the mixture in the consciousness. In other words, the actions which happen in a particular totality of births gets carried forward. That is the basis. Action taking its consequences, either immediate or in the next birth. But that is not your rebirth. That is my point. Of course, new births take place. And of course, every conception, something gets infused from the previous happenings, events and deeds. But there is no individual to bear the fruits of his actions. It was not the same ego in the previous birth, and it is not going to be the same ego in the next one. So the basis that I have is, again to repeat Lord Buddha's words, events happen, deeds are done, there is no individual doer thereof. That is my basic concept in life as we know it. There is no individual doer. Everything that happens, happens according to the programming. So, as I said yesterday, do you have free will? Yes, you have free will. But that free will is based on the programming. Therefore, I said, the free will that you do have is counterfeit. But yet you do have free will to make a choice. Once you have made the choice, you have no control whether that choice will actually turn into action. You make a choice and you decide to do a particular thing. You take your recommendation to your boss and he throws it out. So you have the right to make a decision, but whether that decision turns into an action, not in your control. And what consequences though that act will have, even if it happens, is even more beyond your control. Therefore, my point is, there is no reason at all not to make a decision. By all means, take into account all the alternatives and the consequences, and by all means make a decision. In other words, what I am saying is, the answer to a question, if nothing is in my control, what do I do? How do I live my life? It's a valid question. And my answer to that valid question is, do whatever you think you should do. What more freedom can you want? Do whatever you think you should do. What more freedom can anyone want? So whether what you decide to do happens or not is not in your control. And if it happens, what consequences that action will have, not in your control. But I repeat, that does not prevent you from making a decision about what you should do. And that is how you live your life. Making your decisions, doing what you think you should do, and merely watching what happens as God's will. Even that is God's will. So that makes life, I think, simple. That is the basic, those are the basics I want to tell you. So, any questions?
Could I?
Yes, of course.
Like, there seems certain events in one's life that are like big events, very significant, and you easily say, that's my destiny, that was meant to happen. Like Mark yesterday was talking about sending you a letter to Bombay and it got there and back in 10 days. And for me to get here, it would have been difficult, but then various things happened and made it very easy or very comfortable. So there seem to be events that we say are like our destiny, and other events, ordinary day-to-day small things, do not have that significance. But I'm sure you would make no distinction, or would you, between like a big destiny and small acts of fate or God's will, or I mean, sometimes God seems to be really taking a keen interest, and other times he's forgotten about you.
So, you mean, do I make a distinction between the big events and the small things? None at all. None at all. Every little thing and every big thing is an event or an action which can happen only according to God's will.
But it does seem like being around a sage, somehow there's a flow, a smoothness of events that often in ordinary unenlightened life does not seem to be so obvious or happen.
I'm sorry, can you repeat it, please?
Sorry, around a sage,
yes,
there seems to be a flow of events, an easy happening, whereas in our ordinary lives often it seems to be a muddle and a mess.
I don't think that is why I said life becomes simpler. I did not say life becomes easier. Life continues to be what it is supposed to be according to the will of God and the destiny of that body-mind organism. So if the body-mind organism of the sage is destined to suffer a backache for a couple of months and not let him go to lie down at all, then that is happening. So it is not life becomes easier. You see, I had a backache for 2 months some time ago. And the peculiar part of that backache, my doctor was absolutely flummoxed. He didn't understand it. I could sit with a certain amount of discomfort, of course. I could stand, I could move about, but I could not lie down. The moment I tried to lay down, there was a sudden spasm of pain. And that continued for 2 months. But the curious part of it is that the pain was there. And as I say again, that was accepted as part of something that was to happen. And curiously, because I could sit and talk, the talks, my morning talks, were not disrupted. The morning talks went on. The pain was there. You see? But the curious part that I've just mentioned is this. If the details of that, how much suffering there was, has not remained in memory. The memory only says there was a backache, bad backache. But there is no memory of any me suffering in those 2 months. Can you understand that? There is no memory of the intensity of suffering. There was memory of an event, of course. There is memory of the event, but not of the intensity of suffering.
And when you were suffering, there was always the witnessing of the suffering.
That when the witnessing of the suffering happens, there is no sufferer. Therefore, I said, suffering has to be there along with enjoyment or joy. But there is no individual sufferer or enjoyer of happiness. Happiness happens, it is accepted. So in the evening, at 7 o'clock, Heiner says, would I like a cup of, a glass of red wine? I said, sure. But at another time, the other Heiner says, would I share a bottle of beer with him? So at that moment, according to the programming, I said, Heiner, look, my stomach, I have a loose stomach. I would rather not. So the choosing happens according to the programming and the state of the body-mind organism. There is truly no one who makes the choice. So suffering is there, the enjoyment is there. But truly there is no one who thinks he is suffering. And that is why it's a curious fact which I have noted. In the memory, there is no suggestion of the intensity of the pain that was there. At that moment there was. But there is nothing remains in memory.
Hello.
Yeah.
I cannot forget thinking about what happened last year between you and me. And I was sitting there and you were sitting in this chair, and then I tried to look at you like this because there was sitting someone in between. So I sneaked in this way to have a good look of you, and then you all of a sudden you came and looked at me, and yeah, and all of a sudden I saw myself looking at you in a total madness. So and I thought, yeah, that was totally me. I was looking at you in a total madness, but you were smiling at me, and I was looking at you in this way, and then you turned serious, and then my thoughts came back and so on, and then I went back with my eyes. So, and because I was thinking and thinking about all the time, the whole year now, so I had to tell you this. And
About this, the only comment I would make, Michael, did you say?
Pardon?
Your name is what?
My name is Hubertus.
Oh, I see.
No, we never had contact by
I know.
talking.
So what I'm saying is that what you have just described.
I don't understand too much, and my ears are not so good.
Yeah. Michael, I mean,
understand English, but
Mark will translate.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, basically, it is an experience which happened. There is no individual experiencer in it. It's an experience which happened. The experiencer came later and tried to interpret it.
Yes, I tried to interpret it because there was no reason actually. Actually, I think I'm a nice guy, being nice too, you were nice to me, I'm nice to you.
That is the interpretation.
But it was not this case.
That is the interpretation I'm talking about. That is the interpretation which happens only when the experiencer came in.
But the question is, why do I have to, it was like looking, don't come closer, that's it, So I'm getting mad. And what do I have to protect for you? This was actually what was going on then. What do I have to protect in front of you?
So that is only when the experiencer came in later. The experience was what you described. The experience comes in later and interprets it. And what you have just said is the interpretation.
You say the only thing which you want to tell me is, okay, can you accept it or not? I could accept it at this moment that I was looking like this. And it was perfectly all right for me.
Quite right.
At this moment.
Yes.
But then the thing was coming.
That is exactly what I'm saying. The experience was in the moment. And that moment it was accepted. The experiencer comes later and interprets it and judges it.
All the other things were rubbish then.
Yes, correct. Absolutely correct. Absolutely correct.
Ramesh, I have a question. This involvement you speak about is actually the responsibility we take for our actions or reactions?
You mean the involvement is in the responsibility you take for your actions? Correct. That is the involvement. That is the involvement. Therefore, I say, an action happens through this body-mind organism. The society likes it. The society praises it. So the praise of the society for an action which has happened through this body-mind organism is the input in this particular body-mind organism. The brain reacts to it and a sense of pleasure arises. So the arising of a sense of pleasure is the natural reaction of the brain to an input. So the arising of the sense of pleasure is the output. You see? But if the understanding is there that that action which brought you praise from the society was not your action, then sense of pleasure may arise, but not a sense of pride. How can pride arise when you know it is not your action? But that does not prevent a sense of pleasure from arising. You see? The other way round. An action happens which is not acceptable to the society. And that action not being acceptable to society is the input, which may bring about a sense of disappointment. That an action which happened was not acceptable to society. Sense of disappointment may arise. You see? But not a sense of guilt. It is not your action. Therefore, not a sense of guilt. So accepting that no action is in your action, two things happen. Whatever the action, there is no sense of pride, there is no sense of guilt. And that's it's the amount of guilt a person carries is enormous, truly enormous. And when this is truly becomes acceptable by the grace of God, then the taking out of that load of guilt is enormous. But more important, if you accept that no action that happens through this is your action, you must also accept that no one is a doer of his action. No one is a doer, not just you, but no one is a doer. So whichever way actions happening through other body, mind, organisms affect you one way or the other, you know that no one has done it. So while an action somebody has done helps you, for the sake of social grace, you may say, thank you very much. But deep down, the understanding is that action which happened at that moment through that body, mind, organism was good for you. But tomorrow, another action might happen through the same body, mind, organism, which may be totally against you. That is the understanding. So therefore, if some action happening through some other body, mind, organism hurts you, then what the understanding does is to tell you that being hurt was the destiny of this body, mind, organism. And being hurt by an action happening through a particular body, mind, organism was also the destiny of this body, mind, organism. But knowing that no one has done anything to hurt anyone, you will not be able to hate him or envy. Therefore, accepting that no one can do anything, either me or anyone else, no pride, no guilt, no hate, no envy, which makes life simple. Not necessarily easier, but simpler.
And another question, Ramesh, is like this. This understanding actually changes the programming.
I beg your pardon?
The understanding changes the programming. The programming actually is the conditioning that we take from our early life and the school and the society and parents and surroundings.
So you mean the position you take in life depends a lot on the programming. That's what you're saying? Yes. And that is why really it is not your stand. That stand which the person takes, this body mind, the mind takes, the intellect takes, the ego takes, is based on the programming and the destiny of the body, mind, organism. So any stand that you take on any subject at any moment is exactly the stand this body, mind, organism was supposed to take according to the will of God and the destiny of this body, mind, organism.
Yes, hello, Ramesh.
Yes.
A question to the realization of the will of God.
Yes.
For some months, I met a man and who wants to sell a thing, and I want this thing, and I know this man cheat me.
Yes.
But there was the other part in me who has done this, and I'm right. This man cheats me, and now the question. At first, to realize that this man cheat me, is this the will of God, which I realize, and what's easier for me, to make the deal with him or not to make the deal with him? What is easier for me in my life?
You see, what happens is, your question is, how do you deal with that man again? Is that your question?
There's no deal with this man
again.
Again.
That's the end of the matter. You see, the only way is that somebody cheated you. That is a fact, which you accept.
But I realize it before this deal. And what's better for me, to say, stop, I don't make this deal with this man,
Yeah.
or to do this deal?
So, You don't make a deal with that man. That's the action that is taken. That is the action that is taken by the working mind. The working mind says, this man I cannot rely on. Therefore, I shall have no more dealings with a particular man. That is your working mind making a decision.
Okay. Ramesh, this is the first time I've had the opportunity to be in your presence after reading your books and finding a great deal of acceptance there. But the points I would like to clear up are those that I feel need clarification. I think I understand, but I've thought that before, and it hasn't turned out to be the case. So what I want to know is in the area of acceptance. You can be in a very peaceful state, feeling quite at peace, and feel that whatever happens is okay. Then desire, which many people teach is bad and you need to get rid of desire and all that, comes by. And if you can truly deal with this desire and say, that's okay, it seems like that all of a sudden this peace is right back, that you're not hung up on this desire. It might be the same thing with a fear. Like maybe I offended someone over here. And instead of saying, well, gee, I shouldn't have done that and so forth, that, well, that's okay to have that fear, that's okay to have that desire, or whatever happens. And then the peace seems to return. Is this essentially what you're saying? Is that essentially what you're teaching?
Basically, what I'm saying is this. Whatever has happened could not have happened unless it is the will of God and the destiny of those who are concerned with the effects of what has happened. Whatever has happened could not have happened unless it is the will of God. Whichever way that action affects anybody. And based on that, what further actions you should take, it is your free will to make a decision. You have the full freedom to make a decision as to what you would do in future based on that experience. You make a decision based on previous experience. But whether that decision turns out to be an action and what effects or consequences that action will have is again not in your control. But my basic point again and again, whatever happens does not take away your freedom to do whatever you like. You are free to make any choice. That is the main point I would like to stress. This understanding does not restrict or prohibit or inhibit any of your actions in future. You continue to do whatever you think you should do. And it's a tremendous sense of freedom to be able to do whatever you want to do without worrying about what God wants you to do. You see, generally a person would say, I would like to do what God wants me to do. And I said, not your worry. Do whatever you like. And if it happens not because you wanted it, but because it was the will of God. But that does not prevent you, I repeat again and again, it does not restrict your freedom to do exactly what you think you should do. That full freedom continues.
I would like to go back to the first 5 minutes of your teaching yesterday. that it seems that's where I lost track, you see. And so it's this matter about concepts. You talked about concepts. There were these anecdotes, and it sounded to me like concepts have nothing to do with truth. It sounded like, well, it could be true, or the opposite might as well be true, and all that counts is if it's, I don't know, if it's useful or if it's pleasant or what, but I'm afraid I have a different concept of a concept.
Yes. You see, I told you yesterday, a concept is something which can be interpreted in different ways.
Yes, but I don't understand that. I don't understand that.
What is your concept of a concept?
Well, there is some truth in it. You could have a concept that the moon is rectangular, but and this could be. I could believe that the consequences, if I would believe that, the consequences would be very pleasant, very nice. But still, I cannot believe it if I don't have the feeling that there's some truth in it. You understand?
What
No.
you are saying, I think, is a concept is acceptable to one, not acceptable to another. A concept is to that person for whom that concept is acceptable. That person interprets the concept as being the truth. So the person who accepts a concept accepts it as the truth. And
But
I want to be perfectly clear that it is not the truth. It is still a concept pointing to the truth. A concept is useful only to the extent that it points to the truth. And the other use of the concept is that a concept helps to remove the earlier misconception, if any. In Ramana Maharshi's words, a concept is to be used like a thorn to remove another thorn embedded in your foot. You take a thorn, remove the thorn embedded in your foot, then you throw both the thorns away. Once a concept points to something and you have seen to what it points, the concept is no longer any use. You throw that concept away. Moment you see that to which the concept was pointing, then the concept that which points to the truth is only one. The truth is nothing happens unless it is God's will. And even that becomes a concept in phenomenality. The only truth is...
Could the opposite also be a valid concept?
You see, valid concept.
Yes.
Valid concept. A concept is valid only for that person who is able to accept it.
But is there no objectivity? Is it that just, I mean, is it arbitrary like that for
It
the
is
one
arbitrary.
person? That is true for the other person.
Yes.
That is true.
You see, I'll tell you what I read is a report that Abraham Lincoln, you know, the American president, he was a lawyer. He was a lawyer. And it is told that he went to the court and won a case for his client on a certain point. In the afternoon, he went to the court, took up another case exactly opposite, and won that also. That's what I think. So a concept, you can whichever way you like, and depends on your power to make the other person accept your concept. So he was able to make the judge, same judge accept one, and make the same judge accept another concept in the afternoon. Both the judgments made, do the judges sleep at night? I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
But a concept is a concept. And the only thing which is not a concept is that which needs no interpretation and which no one is able to deny. And that is the impersonal awareness of existence. I am. That is the only truth. And the untruth becomes when the individual says, I am because I do. That is where the ego comes. So all that the self-realization means is to removal of that ego which hides the truth. Ego is the concept. Ego is the creator of concepts, which is the mind intellect. The ego is the mind intellect, the creator of concepts. So when that ego is pushed aside, what remains is the truth for all time.